The wind howled like a hungry wolf outside Alara's small cabin, a constant reminder of the bitter Montana winter of 1877. Each gust rattled the single pane of glass, threatening to tear it from its frame. Inside, the chill bit deep, seeping into her bones despite the threadbare shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the tiny stovepipe, a desperate effort to coax warmth from the last few scraps of wood she had. It wasn't enough. The cold was a living thing, always present, always demanding. Alara shivered, not just from the cold, but from the emptiness in her stomach. It had been days since she'd had a proper meal. A few dried berries, a sliver of jerky, long gone now. Her pantry, once modestly stocked by her late husband, Thomas, was barren. He had been gone for nearly a year, taken by a sudden fever, leaving her alone in this unforgiving land. The grief was a dull ache, but the hunger was a sharp, persistent pain, a clawing beast inside her. She ran a chapped hand over her worn dress, remembering better times. Thomas had been strong, his laughter filling this cabin, his hands skilled at trapping and hunting. Now the silence pressed in, heavy and cold. She had tried to keep his small fur trade going, but her hands, accustomed to mending and cooking, were not suited for skinning pelts in the freezing air. The few coins she'd earned had quickly vanished, spent on flour and salt that were now only memories. The last of her kindling lay in a small pile beside the stove, barely enough for another hour's heat. Beyond that, there was nothing. No more food, no more fuel, no more hope. Her breath plumed in the frigid air of the cabin, a visible sign of her dwindling life force. Her cheeks were sunken, her eyes hollow, reflecting the stark reality of her situation. Survival had become a day-to-day battle, and she was losing. Her gaze fell upon the small, empty sack where flour used to be. A desperate plan, born of pure need, began to form in her mind. It was a terrible thought, one that shamed her, but the alternative was simply to lie down and let the cold take her. And Alara, despite everything, was not ready to give up. Not yet. The desperate plan, once a whisper of shame, grew into a roaring necessity as the last embers in Alara's stove died. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, she pulled on her worn coat and wrapped a thin scarf around her face, bracing herself against the biting wind. The walk to town felt endless, each step through the deep snow a struggle against the elements and her own weakening body. Her boots, patched countless times, offered little protection from the frigid ground. The town, usually bustling with the hardy folk of Montana, was quiet under the blanket of snow. A few plumes of smoke rose from chimneys, hinting at the warmth and food Alara so desperately craved. She kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of the few people she passed. She knew their pity, or worse, their judgment. They had their own struggles, their own mouths to feed. Her destination was the bakery, its windows fogged with warmth and the inviting smell of fresh bread. The scent alone made her stomach clench with a painful hunger. She saw Mrs. Gable inside, her stout figure bustling behind the counter, arranging loaves. Alara waited, shivering, until a moment when Mrs. Gable turned her back to fetch something from the back room. This was her chance. With a surge of adrenaline, Alara pushed open the door. A small bell tinkled, a sound that seemed to echo her guilt. Her eyes darted to the counter, finding a freshly baked loaf, still warm, cooling on a rack. Her heart pounded like a drum against her ribs. She moved quickly, her movements stiff from cold and fear. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, closed around the crusty bread. It felt impossibly heavy, a treasure beyond measure. Just as she turned to flee, Mrs. Gable reappeared, her eyes widening in surprise. "Alara. What are you doing?" she cried, her voice sharp with disbelief. Alara didn't answer. Shame burned her face, but the desperate need for survival pushed her onward. She clutched the bread to her chest and stumbled out the door, the bell jingling wildly behind her. The cold air hit her face, but it was the rising shouts from within the bakery that truly froze her. She ran, her legs aching, the loaf of bread a beacon of hope, and a heavy burden of guilt in her arms. She knew what she had done was wrong, but she also knew that without it, she wouldn't last another day. Alara stumbled out of the bakery, the stolen bread clutched to her chest, her heart a wild bird in her ribs. The cold air hit her, but it was the rising shouts from within that truly froze her. Mrs. Gable's cries of "thief" pierced the crisp winter air, quickly drawing attention. Doors creaked open along the street, and faces, once obscured by the dim light of winter, now peered out, curious and then accusing. She ran, her legs aching, the loaf of bread a beacon of hope, and a heavy burden of guilt in her arms. But her weakened body was no match for the outrage of the townsfolk. A burly man, Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, was the first to reach her. His strong hand clamped down on her arm, pulling her to a halt. The bread slipped from her grasp and fell into the pristine snow, a stark white canvas now marred by the dark crust. "Ilara, how could you?" he growled, his face a mask of disappointment and anger. Others gathered, their murmurs growing into a chorus of condemnation. Mrs. Gable joined the group, her face red with indignation. "She stole from my bakery, right off the cooling rack." Ilara tried to speak, to explain the gnawing hunger, the empty pantry, the desperate cold. But the words caught in her throat, strangled by shame and the sudden rush of tears. She looked at their faces, faces she had known for years, Mrs. Gable, who had offered kind words after Thomas's passing, Mr. Henderson, who had fixed her wagon wheel. Now their eyes held only judgment, cold and hard as the winter ice. "She needs to learn a lesson," someone muttered. "We can't have folks stealing in our town." "Leave her in the snow," another voice suggested, harsher than the rest. "Let her feel the cold she brought upon herself." And so they dragged her, not gently, away from the warmth of the bakery, away from the relative shelter of the main street. They pulled her past the general store, past the church, until they reached the edge of town where the wind swept across the open fields. With a final, cruel shove, they released her. She stumbled, falling face first into a deep drift of snow. No one offered a hand, no one spoke a word of pity. They simply stood, a huddle of dark figures against the pale snow, watching her. Then one by one they turned and walked away, back to their warm homes, leaving Ilara utterly alone. The cold clawed at her, sharper now, mixed with the stinging pain of their rejection. The snow, once a symbol of the world's beauty, became her prison. The townsfolk's backs disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving Ilara alone at the mercy of the biting wind. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a physical weight pressing her down, stealing the last vestiges of warmth from her body. Her fingers and toes had long since gone numb, and a strange, heavy tiredness began to creep through her limbs. The shame of her act, the cruelty of their punishment, mixed with the bone-deep exhaustion. She tried to push herself up to escape the drift, but her muscles protested, weak and unresponsive. Each breath was a shallow gasp, icy air burning her lungs. The snow, once soft and inviting in its fresh fall, now felt like a suffocating blanket. Her vision blurred, the white landscape around her swirling into indistinct shapes. A dull ache spread through her head, a sign that the cold was winning its battle. Memories flickered through her mind. Thomas's smile, the warmth of their small cabin before winter's grip tightened, the smell of baking bread that now felt like a cruel joke. She thought of her mother's lullabies of sunnier days. These thoughts, once a source of comfort, now felt distant like echoes from another life. A strange peace began to settle over her. The pain lessened, replaced by a growing numbness. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, wanting to close, to surrender to the soft, white embrace of the snow. Her body, pushed beyond its limits by hunger, cold, and despair, was slowly giving up. Hope, that fragile flame she had desperately clung to, flickered and died. She felt herself sinking deeper into the drift, the powdery snow rising around her face. The wind, which had seemed so fierce moments ago, now sounded like a distant whisper. A profound weariness enveloped her, a desire to simply rest, to cease the struggle. Her breath became shallower, her heartbeat slower. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness claim her, no longer fighting, no longer caring. The world faded, and Ilara collapsed fully into the snow, her body a still, cold form, lost to the vast, indifferent wilderness. The world had faded to a soft, cottony blackness for Ilara, a quiet surrender to the overwhelming cold. She felt nothing, thought nothing, simply existed as a still form beneath the falling snow. But fate, in its unpredictable way, had not yet finished with her. Miles away, a solitary figure named Silas was making his rounds, checking his traps. Silas was a trapper, a man of the wilderness whose life was measured by the seasons and the tracks in the snow. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his eyes keen and observant, missing little in the vast expanse of the Montana frontier. He was returning to his cabin, a small, well-built refuge hidden deep within the trees, when a flicker of something unusual caught his eye. A dark shape, half buried in a snowdrift at the edge of the tree line, was out of place. It was too far from the main trail, too still to be an animal. Silas, accustomed to the silence and subtle movements of the wild, approached with caution, his heavy fur coat rustling softly. As he drew closer, his heart gave a lurch. It was a person, a woman, completely still and covered in a fresh layer of snow. He knelt beside her, his gloved hand gently brushing away the snow from her face. Her skin was pale blue, her lips tinged with purple. She was freezing, perhaps even gone. But then a faint wisp of breath, so tiny he almost missed it, escaped her lips. She was alive, barely. Without a moment's hesitation, Silas carefully scooped Alara into his strong arms. She was surprisingly light, her body stiff and cold. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart, a desperate flutter against his chest. Carrying her was slow work through the deep snow, but Silas was a man of immense strength and resolve. He knew every twist and turn of the woods, navigating the treacherous terrain with practiced ease. His cabin, a haven of warmth and shelter, appeared through the thick pines. Smoke curled from its chimney, a welcoming sign of the fire he'd left burning low before his rounds. He pushed open the heavy wooden door with his shoulder and stepped inside, carrying the frozen woman to his bunk. The warmth of the cabin, though still faint, was a stark contrast to the deathly cold outside. Silas knew he had to act fast if he was to save her. Silas wasted no time. After placing Alara on his bunk, he quickly stripped off her frozen outer layers, replacing them with thick, dry blankets and furs. He stoked the embers in his stone fireplace, feeding them with dry kindling and larger logs, until a cheerful, roaring fire filled the small cabin with light and precious heat. The air, once frigid, began to warm, chasing away the deadly chill that clung to Alara's skin. He then set about preparing a simple meal, a hearty broth made from dried vegetables and game, heated slowly over the fire. The rich, savory smell soon filled the cabin, a scent Alara hadn't experienced in weeks. He watched her closely, his brow furrowed with concern, checking for any signs of waking. After what felt like an eternity, Alara stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, slowly at first, then wider. The firelight danced in her eyes, momentarily confusing her. She blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. This wasn't her cold, empty cabin. This was a small, cozy room, filled with the comforting crackle of a fire and the smell of stew. Her gaze fell upon Silas. He sat quietly on a wooden stool nearby, watching her with a calm, steady look. He was a big man, rugged and bearded, his face etched with the lines of outdoor living. Fear, sharp and immediate, pierced through the fog of her semi-conscious state. Where was she? Who was this man? The last thing she remembered was the biting cold and the backs of the townsfolk disappearing into the snow. "You're safe," Silas said, his voice low and gentle, as if sensing her alarm. "You were out in the snow. I brought you here." Alara tried to sit up, but her body felt weak and heavy. She pulled the thick furs closer, her eyes scanning the small cabin, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. She was a woman alone in a strange man's cabin deep in the wilderness. Her mind, still clouded by cold and shock, raced with suspicions. Was he a bandit? Would he hurt her? The cruelty of the townsfolk was still fresh, making her distrust every new face. Silas, seeing her fear, simply offered her a wooden bowl. "Eat," he urged softly, his eyes kind. "You need your strength." The steam from the broth warmed her face, and the hunger, momentarily forgotten, roared back to life. But her mistrust was stronger. She stared at the bowl, then back at him, her gaze narrow and wary. She said nothing, her silence a shield against the unknown. Alara watched Silas with narrowed eyes, clutching the furs tighter around her. The warmth of the cabin was slowly thawing her body, but her heart remained a block of ice, hardened by the cruelty of the town and the fear of this unknown man. She refused the bowl of stew, her stomach growling in protest, but her mind screamed caution. Silas didn't press her. He simply set the bowl down on a small table near the bunk within her reach, then turned to tend to the fire. He moved with a quiet efficiency, adding more wood, stirring the embers until they glowed fiercely. He didn't speak much, which Alara found both unnerving and, strangely, a little comforting. His silence didn't feel threatening, just present. Hours passed. The cabin grew warmer, chasing away the last of the deep chill from Alara's bones. The smell of the stew was a constant, tantalizing reminder of her hunger. Finally, the gnawing pain became too much to bear. When Silas was busy outside, chopping more wood, she cautiously reached for the bowl. The broth was still warm, rich, and savory. She took a tentative sip, then another, and soon, despite her fear, she was devouring the simple meal, the warmth spreading through her body like a healing balm. Silas returned, his arms laden with fresh logs. He saw the empty bowl but said nothing, only offered a small, gentle nod. Later, he brought her a cup of warm, sweetened tea brewed from local herbs. "For your strength," he murmured, placing it beside her. Days bled into one another. Alara remained on the bunk, weak but slowly regaining her strength. Silas, true to his word, continued to show her nothing but kindness. He brought her fresh water, made sure the fire never dwindled, and cooked simple, nourishing meals, always leaving them within reach without demanding conversation or thanks. He shared his meager supplies of dried meat, root vegetables, and flour, never once hinting that she was a burden or that his resources were limited. He would sometimes speak of the wilderness, of the animals he trapped, the signs of the changing weather. His voice was soft, his words steady, never prying. Alara listened, her guard slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to lower. His actions spoke louder than any words. He was tending to her as if she were a precious, injured creature, expecting nothing in return. The kindness was so unexpected, so pure after the harshness she had endured that it felt like a foreign language, one she was slowly, hesitantly learning to understand. The days continued to pass in Silas's cabin, each one a slow, gentle step away from the brink of death. Alara's body, once stiff with cold and fear, began to regain its strength. But it was her heart, so long encased in a shell of grief and mistrust, that truly started to awaken. She watched Silas as he went about his chores, mending a trap, carving a piece of wood by the firelight, or simply staring out the window at the snow-covered forest. He never asked for anything, never demanded an explanation, just offered quiet comfort and constant care. One afternoon, a fierce blizzard raged outside, shaking the cabin walls. Alara sat by the fire, wrapped in furs, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in months. Silas was preparing a stew, humming a low, tuneless melody. He looked up, catching her gaze, and offered a small, soft smile. It wasn't a smile of pity or judgment, but one of genuine warmth. In that moment, something shifted within Alara. "Why?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. It was the first word she had spoken since waking. Silas turned, his movements unhurried. "Why what? Why did you help me? Why are you kind?" The words tumbled out, laced with a vulnerability she hadn't realized she still possessed. The town had shown her such cruelty. This man, a stranger, was showing her the opposite. It confused her. He stirred the stew thoughtfully. "Saw you out there," he said simply. "No one should be left to freeze. It's not right." He looked at her then, his eyes deep and honest. "And kindness. It's all some of us have to give in this world, Alara, especially when the world is so hard." His simple answer, devoid of grand gestures or expectations, struck a chord deep within her. It was a truth spoken without pretense. She thought of the townsfolk, their harsh judgments, their quickness to condemn. And then she thought of Silas, who had seen her at her lowest, her most desperate, and had offered only warmth and sustenance. A tear, the first in a long time, traced a path down her cheek, warm against her cooling skin. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a thawing. A crack appeared in the frozen wall around her heart, allowing a tiny sliver of light to peek through. His compassion was a gentle hand, coaxing her back to life, reminding her that not all humanity was cruel. Slowly, tentatively, Alara began to believe in the possibility of goodness again. The tiny crack in Alara's heart widened into a fragile opening after Silas's simple words about kindness. A few more days of shared silence, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, built a quiet understanding between them. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the fire cast dancing patterns on the cabin walls, Alara found her voice again. "My husband, Thomas," she began, her voice soft and a little shaky. "He died last spring. A fever took him fast." She paused, the memory still fresh, a sharp pain in her chest. "He was a good man, worked hard, but when he was gone, everything, it just fell apart. The winter was too much. I had nothing left." All that She recounted the slow, agonizing descent into poverty, the dwindling supplies, the gnawing hunger, and finally, the desperate act of stealing the bread. Her voice broke as she described the townsfolk's cruelty, their cold eyes, and the final, brutal shove into the snow. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the flames, his expression unreadable, yet his quiet presence was a comfort. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just listened. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the wind outside. Then Silas spoke, his voice low and steady. "It's a hard land, this Montana, takes a lot from folks." He shifted on his stool, looking at the worn leather of his boots. "I came out here years ago. After I lost my own family, sickness, took them both, my wife and our little girl, in one winter." Alara looked at him, a sudden understanding dawning in her eyes. The quiet strength, the gentle compassion, the solitary existence, it all made sense now. He too had known profound loss, had faced the harshness of life alone. "I tried to stay in town," he continued, his voice tinged with a distant sadness. "But every face, every street, it just reminded me, so I came out here. The wilderness, it doesn't judge, it just is, and out here I found a different kind of peace. A lonely peace sometimes, but peace nonetheless." He looked at Alara, a shared understanding passing between them. They were two broken souls, brought together by the very cruelty and hardship that had nearly claimed them. In his quiet admission, Silas offered her not just warmth and food, but the unspoken gift of shared sorrow, a bond forged in the crucible of their individual struggles. For the first time since Thomas's death, Alara felt truly seen, truly understood. And in that shared vulnerability, the last remnants of her mistrust began to crumble. The shared stories of loss had woven an invisible thread between Alara and Silas, pulling them closer than either had expected. As the harsh Montana winter continued its relentless grip, days in the cabin turned into weeks, and a new rhythm settled into their lives. Alara, fully recovered in body, now found herself helping Silas with chores. She mended his worn shirts with nimble fingers, a task that felt familiar and comforting. She helped prepare meals, adding her own touch to his simple stews, and found joy in the warmth of the fire, no longer just a source of survival, but a symbol of their shared sanctuary. Silas, in turn, began to open up more. He taught her about the wilderness, pointing out different animal tracks in the snow, explaining the habits of the forest creatures. He showed her how to prepare game, patiently guiding her hands. His quiet demeanor remained, but now it was filled with a gentle warmth, a silent appreciation for her presence. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable quiet, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the wind outside. Alara found herself looking forward to his return from his trap lines each day, a sense of anxious anticipation she hadn't felt since Thomas was alive. She would watch the tree line, a small smile touching her lips when she saw his tall figure emerge from the snow-laden pines. And Silas, though he rarely showed outward emotion, would always offer a soft smile upon seeing her, a silent acknowledgement of the warmth she brought to his solitary world. Their hands would sometimes brush as they passed a cup or a tool, and a spark, soft but undeniable, would pass between them. It was a feeling Alara hadn't expected to experience again, a gentle stirring in her heart that whispered of something new, something hopeful. It wasn't the passionate, youthful love she had shared with Thomas, but a deeper, quieter affection born of shared hardship and profound kindness. It was a love that understood pain, that valued resilience, and that found beauty in the simple act of survival together. The harshness of the wilderness, which had once threatened to consume them both, now served as a backdrop for this unexpected blossoming. They were two lonely souls, finding solace and a profound connection in each other's company, a tender flame ignited against the vast, cold backdrop of the Montana frontier. They had both known cruelty, but in each other they were finding a profound, unexpected love. Spring slowly began to whisper through the Montana wilderness, the snow retreating in patches, revealing the dark earth beneath. The long, brutal winter had tested Alara and Sila's, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond between them. Their quiet affection had deepened into a profound love, a gentle strength that settled into the very fabric of their days. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the sounds of melting snow dripping from the eaves a soothing melody, Alara looked at Sila's. "What will you do now that winter is ending?" she asked, her voice soft. Silas poked at the embers with a long stick. "Keep on as I always have, I suppose," he said, his gaze distant. "The traps will need mending, and soon the spring hunts will begin." He paused, then turned his steady gaze to her. "And you, Alara, where will you go?" Alara felt a pang in her chest. The thought of leaving this warm cabin, of leaving Sila's, filled her with a new kind of dread, different from the hunger and cold, but equally powerful. Her old cabin felt like a distant memory, a place of hardship and sorrow. This cabin with Sila's felt like home. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing left for me in town and after." After what they did, she trailed off, the memory still fresh but less stinging now, softened by Silas's kindness. Silas reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers. "Stay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay here, Alara. We can face whatever comes together. This land is hard, but it's less so when you're not alone." Alara's heart swelled. It was not a grand proposal, no flowery words, but a simple, honest offer of a shared life, rooted in the harsh reality of their world. It was an offer of partnership, of strength and unity. She saw in his eyes not just kindness, but a deep, abiding love mirroring her own. A small smile, truly hopeful this time, bloomed on Alara's face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Silas, I'll stay." And so, as the wilderness shed its icy cloak, Alara and Silas embarked on a new chapter. They worked side by side, tending the cabin, preparing for the seasons ahead. The cruel world outside still existed, but within the walls of their secluded home, they had built a sanctuary of warmth, trust, and unexpected love. They knew challenges would come, but they would face them not as two solitary, suffering souls, but as one, finding solace in their shared journey and strength in their enduring affection. Their love, forged in the depths of winter and tempered by hardship, was a beacon of hope in the vast, wild heart of Montana.